The Democrats' $3.5 trillion reconciliation package is facing opposition from within the party, perhaps most notably from Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who has gone on record as being opposed to corporate and income tax increases being included in the bill. Because of her opposition to these provisions, Senate Democrats are trying to find an alternative way to finance the bill's proposals. One way that has been suggested is a carbon tax, which Oregon Senator Ron Wyden, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, has said Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has urged him to draft a proposal in support of. However, the senator acknowledges how politically unpopular the idea is, noting how efforts in Washington state to impose a carbon tax were derailed by concerns that would raise the price of electricity. In fact, just months ago, the White House rejected suggestions by other Democratic senators to include a carbon tax in the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure package, as they believed it will be detrimental to the middle class. And these concerns are based in reality. The truth is that a carbon tax, which has for years been hailed as a market-based solution to climate change by putting a price tag on all emissions, would be woefully inadequate at even taking a step towards combating the climate crisis. There are several reasons why. Number one, it was promoted as a marketing ploy by ExxonMobil. Exxon has spent years fighting against climate science, trying to deny the existence of human-made global warming, and aggressively lobbying against environmental regulations. This has rightfully earned them the ire of environmentalists, as well as average Americans, for looking out for their own bottom line rather than the health and well-being of the population. In order to clean their image, they announced their support for a carbon tax. However, as Chief Lobbyist Keith McCoy stated in an interview with an undercover reporter earlier this year, the company's support for the policy is all in act, knowing that Congress will never pass it. He says, quote, "Nobody is going to propose a tax on all Americans, and the cynical side of me says, yeah, we kind of know that, but it gives us a talking point that we can say in, well, what is ExxonMobil for? Well, we're for a carbon tax," end quote. Even without McCoy openly admitting this information, the fact that one of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world is in support of a seemingly environmentalist policy should sound the alarm bells as to how impactful at mitigating the impacts of climate change it really is. And even if a carbon tax does somehow pass, the fee that big polluters like Exxon would be paying would be a small drop in the bucket of their overall profits, and they would feel no financial consequences in the long run. Even more recently, the head of the top utility company in New Jersey has come out in favor of a carbon tax, furthering big polluters' attempts to appear more eco-friendly. Number two, it does not reduce carbon emissions. In fact, in many ways, a carbon tax could do the exact opposite. It could increase CO2 emissions if implemented. In 2008, British Columbia passed a carbon tax for the province, covering only carbon emissions used in industrial processes as well as transportation and heating. The tax covers 70% of the province's emissions and is designed to be revenue neutral, meaning that the revenue generated from it would be translated into rebates and tax credits for British Columbia's taxpayers. However, the policy did not meet its intended goal, and between 2009, the first full year it was in effect for, and 2014, emissions from taxed sources rose by over 4%, while emissions from non-taxed sources dropped by more than half of that percentage, according to a report from Food and Water Watch. In addition, the non-governmental organization, or NGO, cites research for the Citizens Climate Lobby, which studied a carbon tax plan that actually increased the use of fracked gas for electricity. As the NGO states regarding this finding, quote, "That means more fracking, more pipelines, more compressor stations, and more power plants. The impacts of this kind of fossil fuel development disproportionately impacts low-income communities and communities of color," end quote. While economists love to argue that a carbon tax is the most impactful way to move away from fossil fuels, in practice, that hypothesis has not come to fruition. Number three, it is a regressive tax. A regressive tax is a tax where all taxpayers, regardless of income, pay the same amount in dollars. This disproportionately hits lower-income Americans in the pocketbook, as they spend a larger portion of their money on these taxes when compared to higher-income taxpayers. While proponents of a carbon tax like to claim that this problem can be offset through having the revenue being returned to those low-income groups via rebates or tax credits, The reality of poor as well as minority Americans having their bills strained by energy costs cannot be ignored. According to research done by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE, blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans are spending significantly more on energy than the average American household. And due to the fact that these communities are among the hardest hit by the negative public health and economic ramifications caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, their budgets are being stretched thin even further so by their energy bills. Once again, people would argue that they would receive their money back from the government under the implementation of a more progressive carbon tax. However, this argument obfuscates the aforementioned point about how the increased amount of fracking under certain carbon tax plans would further harm these communities. It also fails to address the elephant in the room regarding the inadequacies of a carbon tax. Number 4. Our planet cannot afford it. The IPCC report is clear. The impacts of climate change are approaching faster than expected, and scientists have called the report a code red for humanity. Passing a carbon tax would sidestep the need to get off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Not only that, but as progressive climate organizations, including the Climate Justice Alliance and the aforementioned Food and Water Watch, state in a letter addressed to congressional majority leaders in opposition to a hypothetical carbon tax proposal, quote, "A carbon tax will also create more dependence on fossil fuels by connecting government funding to continuing pollution, which will make a transition off fossil fuels all the more challenging to accomplish as social programs will rely on revenue from pollution. This perverse relationship will cause us to choose between the health of vulnerable communities and our climate or funding government programs, a dichotomy we should avoid at all costs," end quote. And they are absolutely right. If a carbon tax is implemented, in addition to only a negligible at best reduction in emissions, it will ironically increase the federal government's addiction to fossil fuels, as they will now be able to generate revenue from the emissions of big polluters. Finally, the Democrats' attempt to craft a proposal for a carbon tax plan to please Senator Sinema is flat out unnecessary. Instead of capitulating to her demands, as she, not so privately, meets with big-moneyed corporate interests to derail the reconciliation bill, Democratic leaders such as Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer should be threatening her with a primary challenge if she doesn't agree with what the majority of the Democratic base wants. Over 80% of the Arizona Democratic Party has already censored her in light of her opposition to the proposed corporate tax hikes. The threat of her losing renomination is real, and if Democrats are willing to actually fight for their agenda, they could use the bully pulpit to get her to support it. A carbon tax is not an acceptable alternative to getting off of fossil fuels. The magnitude of the climate crisis is too severe for incremental change, and we must act like it. Find a group near you that is taking direct action to mitigate the impacts of climate change and get involved, or talk with like-minded friends, relatives, or neighbors about taking the necessary actions that will actually matter in preventing an ecological collapse. This is the only planet we've ever called home. We must act with the urgency that this catastrophe demands we act with.